Okay, so today we're going to look at the idea that saturated fat causes heart disease actually is false and came from one man who deleted the data that disagreed with him. His name was Ancel Keys, and I've talked about this before, but I figured I'd have a whole video dedicated to this horrible guy. So first, what was the Ancel Keys study? So it was a 7-country study, but it actually had data from 22 countries. He studied the relationship between fat intake and heart disease, and like I said, only published data from 7 out of the 22 countries, and of course, only the ones that supported his hypothesis. The 15 excluded countries, additionally, showed the opposite trend that he was investigating. So this is scientifically fraud. So what exactly did the excluded data show? France showed high saturated fat intake, actually was connected to low heart disease. In West Germany, high fat was correlated with low cardiovascular mortality. In Finland and Netherlands, similar fat intake actually was found to have different outcomes. But it's more important to look at the full data set, which shows no consistent relationship between the two factors at all. So you can see that Keys had this conclusion first and then chose his data accordingly simply to fit that. So this is a big deal too. Who actually funded Ancel Keys? Because he was paid to do this. Well, the Sugar Research Foundation paid Keys in the 1960s. And the internal documents published in the JAMA Internal Medicine in 2016 confirmed that these results were in fact wrong. The foundation wanted fat blame, not sugar. And Keys, who was getting paid, delivered exactly that. And unfortunately, even though this has been proved to be a fraudulent study, the dietary guidelines that followed were still built on this foundation and are still today. So what is saturated fat actually doing? I talk about this almost every video because it's so important, because it raises LDL, but also raises HDL proportionately. Native LDL is not the problem. Oxidized LDL is, which I'll talk about in the next slide. So guess what does not oxidize? Saturated fat, because it has no double bonds to break. It's actually very structurally sound. So saturated fat directly raises testosterone, which an RCT confirmed, and also humans have been eating saturated fat for 300,000 years. Long time to have been directly causing heart disease. It's almost like it's a beneficial thing that we want to be eating. So like I said, what actually causes that oxidization of the LDL? Seed oils, obviously they're always the problem. Linoleic acid produces 4-HNE under heat and digestion. Very important to look at. Dietary sugar, of course, so also fructose, which obviously from fruit is 11 times more glycating than glucose, which is insane. And both were also introduced at scale in the 20th century. You could get fruit from all over the world, and seed oils really became a popular thing to eat. And guess what correlates with that increase of fruit and seed oils? Heart disease. Wow, not saturated fat. The first recorded atherosclerosis, which was pre-agriculture Egypt, not hunter-gatherer. So if you don't know, the Egyptians really started that whole grain and carb diet, so no wonder that's when the heart diseases started. So what does the actual epidemiology say? A pure study with 135,000 people in 18 countries, so very large scale obviously, showed that higher fat intake actually causes lower mortality. Again, a Framingham heart study showed that people with higher cholesterol in fact lived longer. The Inuit, who live off almost zero carbs and near 100% animal fat, have no documented heart disease pre-contact, and the Maasai, who live on meat, blood, and raw milk, heart disease is essentially absent. They don't really see it there. Thankfully, these are not cherry-picked. They were just simply ignored. So how is that full fraud cycle looking? You have in 1958, Keys publishing that cherry-picked 7 countries data. The sugar industry funds promotion of Keys' hypothesis, of course, paying him in the first place. 1977, the U.S. dietary guidelines built on Keys' entire framework, with Americans and honestly all of North America and a lot of the world being told to eat less fat and more carbohydrates. which we know obviously bad. And guess what came right after that? In the 1980s and 2000s, obesity and type 2 diabetes epidemic began. So it's unfortunate because these guidelines that caused it are still largely in place. Saturated fat is regarded as something you want to avoid by so many people my age, older, everyone. To conclude, saturated fat is not the problem. The problem is industrial seed oil and refined carbohydrates that replaced it. You've really just been eating, and you've been told to eat the opposite of what your biology requires for over 50 years based on a fraudulent study. Unfortunately, the evidence showing against this study came out in 2016, and the guidelines have not changed. But I'll see you in the next one.